In the hushed expanse where the horizon dissolves into an unbroken field of white, there exists a knowing that settles upon the spirit like the first inevitable flake of winter, a knowing that the self is not a gift, but a wound inflicted upon the eternal whole. Let us dwell here in the slow turning of that recognition, and consider the valley called the Hollow of Echoes in the year 1886, where a handful of souls had gathered not in search of dominion over the land, but in pursuit of its absolute embrace. Among them lived Harlan Voss and his wife Eleanor, together with their 4 children, Daniel, Abigail, Thomas, and the youngest, Hannah, whose homestead stood at the farthest edge of the settlement, deliberately placed so that no other roof interrupted the view of the endless plain. The winter arrived early that year, sealing the valley as though the sky itself had lowered a lid upon all conversation with the outer world. Day after day the snow deepened, erasing paths, fences, and eventually the very distinction between one body and the ground beneath it. In the cabin's single room, where the fire burned low and steady, the family began to speak in voices that grew quieter with each passing week. Harlan would begin, not with commands, but with gentle questions. What if the ache we name loneliness is merely the echo of a division that was never meant to last? What if every eye we cling to is the only barrier keeping us from the boundless stillness that waits beyond all naming? The children listened at first with the unease of those who still treasure their separate dreams, yet the isolation pressed upon them like a hand upon the chest, making each breath feel borrowed and each thought feel crowded by the presence of the others. Night after night, the conversation spiraled inward, never repeating, but always descending a single stair. Daniel, the eldest, spoke of the exhaustion carried in the simple act of choosing for himself. Abigail confessed that her laughter now felt like a small betrayal of the quiet that called from outside the window. Thomas described how even his anger at the cold seemed ridiculous once he imagined it belonging to no one in particular. Little Hannah, barely 12, asked the question that unlocked the next layer. If love is real, must it not wish for the beloved to cease being separate? The words did not strike like lightning. They settled like snow, accumulating until the weight became its own kind of mercy. No one wept. Tears would have been another assertion of the self. Instead, they sat in silence after each revelation, letting the fire's crackle speak for them, letting the wind outside affirm that the world had already decided. The pressure did not come from any external decree. It rose from within the circle they formed, from the growing awareness that to remain intact while the others yearned for release was to condemn them to incompleteness. One by one, the children chose their moment, not in haste, but in the same calm ritual that had governed their evenings. Daniel walked out first, on a night when the moon was only a pale smudge behind the clouds. He dug his shallow bed with deliberate care, lay down in the clothes he had worn since the family's arrival, and allowed his father to cover him with the same slow, reverent motions used to tuck him in as a child. The others watched from the doorway until the shape beneath the snow was indistinguishable from the surrounding drifts. When they returned inside, the cabin felt larger, not emptier, as though space had been made for something vaster than 4 bodies. Abigail followed when the stars were hidden for 3 nights running. Her final words around the fire had been simple. "I'm tired of carrying the story of Abigail." The family accompanied her to the place beside her brother, and again the covering was performed with the tenderness of those who understand they are merely assisting a natural process. Thomas went next, his departure marked by a long look exchange with his mother that needed no translation. Hannah, the last of the children, lingered longest, not from fear, but from a desire to witness the change in her parents' faces as each absence deepened their peace. When her turn came, she smiled with the serenity of one who has solved the final equation, and the snow received her as gently as it had the others. Now only Eleanor and Harlan remained. Their evenings grew even quieter, the fire the only witness to conversations that had become almost wordless. Eleanor's choice arrived on the first day of the new year. She prepared her resting place with the same measured steps her children had used, kissed her husband once upon the forehead, and lay down. Harlan performed the final covering alone, then returned to the cabin and sat for many hours without moving. The philosophy had completed its spiral within him. To follow immediately would be to claim the last word, to assert a final I that had witnessed everything. Instead, he sealed the sight, smoothed the snow until no seam remained, and walked back to the central settlement, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back. To those who asked, he spoke of his family answering an inner summons to explore the far ridges once the weather broke. No one pressed further. Every household in the Hollow of Echoes had felt the same slow turning in its own rooms. Every elder had recognized the look in Harlan's eyes because they had seen it reflected in their own mirrors. Silence was not complicity. It was the only honest response to a truth too large for speech. Years folded over the valley like additional layers of snow. The first pages spoke of the burden of names. The middle pages of the relief that comes when names are set aside. The final pages of the exquisite necessity that each release must be voluntary and witnessed, so that no one is left to carry the weight alone, except the very last. As the pages were read aloud in the privacy of the elders' meeting, the spiral turned once more. The philosophy had not died with the Voss family. Other households, in the intervening decades, had performed their own quiet departures, each believing they completed a pattern begun long before. The land itself seemed to have become the only enduring congregation, its members no longer divided by roofs or bloodlines. The elders closed the pages and looked at one another with the same calm Harlan had worn on the day he returned alone. They ordered the site covered again, the garments and writings placed in a sealed chest and lowered into a deeper vault beneath the new hall's foundation. Not in shame, but in recognition that some truths are too complete to be spoken without dissolving the listener. Construction continued elsewhere. The hall was raised, services held, children taught the old hymns. Yet on certain winter nights the wind moves across the valley with a particular hush, and those who walk alone feel the same slow pressure that once settled upon the Voss family. The gentle, insistent knowledge that every step taken in the name of I is a step away from the wholeness that waits beneath the snow. No voice commands. No doctrine is preached. The invitation simply remains, patient as the plain itself, offering the same release that Eleanor and her children accepted without regret. The spiral does not end. It only deepens with each new season, each new soul that pauses to consider whether the self they defend so fiercely is the last illusion standing between them and the eternal, undivided silence. Harlan Voss never returned to explain why he chose to carry the silence alone, and the ground where his family lies offers no further answer. The Hollow of Echoes endures, its new name notwithstanding, and the snow falls each year exactly as it fell in 1886, covering, preserving, waiting. There is no awakening awaiting those who listen too long. There is only the slow, certain understanding that we have always been the snow, and the snow has always been waiting for us to remember. In the years that followed the quiet closing of the Hollow of Echoes Hall, the plain itself seemed to grow heavier, as though each winter deposited not only snow, but also the accumulated gravity of decisions already made. No new families chose the farthest plots anymore. The soil there was said to resist the plow in subtle ways, clods refusing to break cleanly, seed refusing to take root unless planted in the exact center of the old depressions. Children born after 1940 were told the Voss place was simply unlucky, a patch where the wind always found its way under collars and stayed. Yet the wind never howled. It whispered, patient and low, the same monotone syllable repeated across decades until it sounded like breathing. By the late 1950s, the settlement had swollen into a small town with a grain elevator, a single paved street, and a white clapboard church whose steeple caught the first light each morning. The congregation still sang the old hymns, but the tempo had slowed imperceptibly year by year until the melodies hung in the air like fog. Preachers came and went. None stayed longer than 3 winters. They spoke of grace, of redemption, of the promised reunion beyond the grave. The older members listened politely, then returned to their houses and sat in kitchens lit only by oil lamps, staring at the dark window, as though waiting for someone who had already arrived. One January, during the worst storm in living memory, the power line snapped and the town sank into unbroken night. For 11 days, the snow fell without pause, drifts climbing past porch rails, sealing doors and windows until every house became its own sealed vault. In that darkness, people began to remember things they had never quite said aloud. A woman named Clara Hensley, whose husband had vanished 20 winters earlier with the explanation that he needed to check fence lines before the next blizzard, found herself speaking to her grown daughters in the same measured cadence Harlan Voss had once used. She did not accuse the absent man. She simply asked, "If we are each a fragment pretending to be whole, isn't the kindest thing we can do for one another to stop pretending?" The question was not answered with words. Instead, the three women, Clara, her eldest Ruth, and the middle child Esther, moved through the house with the slow choreography of people who have rehearsed a ceremony in silence for years. They prepared nothing elaborate. Only clean linen folded precisely, a basin of melted snow warmed over the last coals, a single candle carried from room to room. When a moment came, Ruth chose the attic because she had always liked to watch snow fall through the small round window there. Esther helped her lie down on the narrow cot, arranged the linen beneath and above her like a second skin, then kissed her forehead the way mothers once kissed sleeping infants. Clara stood at the foot of the cot until the breathing grew shallow, then softer, then absent. They did not weep. Grief would have been another name, another claim to separation. Esther followed 2 nights later in the parlor, choosing the braided rug her grandmother had made. Clara covered her with the same unhurried tenderness, smoothing every wrinkle as though perfecting a letter that would never be posted. When only Clara remained, she did not rush. She spent the final 3 days of the storm walking from window to window, looking out at the white that pressed against the glass like an enormous, patient palm. On the morning the wind finally dropped, she opened the front door, stepped into the drift that reached her waist, and laid down in the place where the path to the barn had once been. No one had to cover her. The snow did that work itself, flake by flake, until the shape of a woman became only another gentle rise in the field. When the roads were cleared and neighbors checked on the Hensley place, they found the house dark but orderly, the beds made, the dishes washed and stacked. 3 sets of folded clothes waited on the kitchen table beside, 3 short notes written in the same careful hand. The notes did not explain or apologize. Each simply said, "Thank you for letting me stop carrying my own story." The town buried the garments in the churchyard under a single marker that read only 3 sisters, though no blood tied them beyond the accident of living in the same house during the same storm. The marker was never carved with dates. Dates would have implied beginning and ending. The town had begun to understand that such distinctions were polite fictions. Word of the Hensley house spread slowly, carried not by gossip, but by the same wind that had once carried Harlan Voss back to the settlement. Other households felt the echo. Not every family acted. Some resisted, clung to the old grammar of mine and yours here and gone. But resistance itself became exhausting. One could fight only so long against the realization that every argument, every embrace, every shouted name was merely a way of delaying the inevitable return to undifferentiated quiet. In the 1970s, a pattern emerged without ever being named. Single departures first, then pairs, then entire households vanishing between first frost and spring thaw. Always the same signs afterward. Clothes folded, houses swept, a single sentence left behind in a visible place. The silence was kinder than I expected. By the turn of the century, the town had shrunk again. Young people left for cities that promised noise and motion. Those who remained were mostly old enough to remember winters when the snow spoke. The church stood half empty on Sundays. The hymns were sung more slowly still, until individual notes seemed to drift apart and hover in the rafters like separate souls, unsure whether to reunite. One elder, a man named Elias Crow, whose own wife and 2 sons had chosen their moment in 1984, began to keep a private ledger, not of deaths, but of completions. He recorded no names, only dates and the number of breaths relinquished that season. The ledger never used the word death. It used release and later simply arrival. In 2017, the county announced plans to widen the old highway that skirted the edge of the former Voss land. Bulldozers arrived in late summer. On the third day of excavation, the crew uncovered not one chamber, but 7, arranged in the rough shape of an incomplete circle. Each contained folded garments, preserved by the dry subsoil, and beneath each sat a thin sheaf of pages written in different hands across different decades. No two accounts repeated the same phrases, yet all traced variations on a single movement. The gradual recognition that individuality is not a birthright, but a temporary loan, and that the honorable borrower eventually returns the principal intact. The foreman, a man from 2 counties away who knew nothing of local history, felt an inexplicable reluctance to disturb the finds. He called the state archaeologist. The archaeologist called the university. Within a week, a team arrived, cordoned the site, began cataloging. They expected artifacts, bones, perhaps evidence of forgotten ritual. What they found instead were clothes that still carried the faint scent of lye soap and cedar, letters that spoke of gratitude rather than despair, and a single photograph, taken perhaps in 1890, showing 7 adults and 9 children standing in front of the Voss cabin, smiling the thin, calm smile of people who have already decided something irrevocable. The photograph was never published. The garments and pages were removed under cover of darkness, transported to a climate-controlled vault beneath the State Historical Society, labeled only as unidentified textiles and documents, mid-19th to early 21st C. The highway was rerouted half a mile south. No explanation was given beyond soil instability. The town accepted the change without protest. They had long since stopped expecting the world to understand. Now, in winters when the temperature drops low enough to crack fence posts, those who remain walk out alone onto the plain. They do not dig. They do not speak of sacrifice. They simply stand until the cold seeps through every layer of wool and denim, until the distinction between skin and wind begins to blur. Some return to their houses. Some do not. Those who stay longest sometimes lie down without premeditation, letting the snow cover them the way a blanket covers a child who has finally stopped fighting sleep. No one searches for them in spring. The town has learned that looking too hard only prolongs the ache of pretending there is still something to find. The plain keeps its own census. The silence keeps expanding, patient, unhurried, offering the same invitation it has offered since the first flakes settled on Harlan Voss's uncovered hand more than a century ago. There is no climax awaiting. No final voice will rise to explain or absolve. There is only the slow, relentless drift of white upon white, covering what was once called a self, covering what was once called a family, covering even the memory of why the word alone once seemed to mean anything at all. And still the snow falls, and still it waits. In the decades after the highway bent away like a man averting his eyes, the plain learned a new patience. It no longer needed storms to speak. A single unseasonal flurry in April, a breath of frost across a windshield in October, even the hush between 2 ordinary breaths at a kitchen table in July. These were enough. The invitation had refined itself into something finer than weather. It lived in the pause after a name is spoken, in the moment a hand hesitates above a doorknob, in the exact second when the mind realizes it has been narrating its own story for years and the voice is growing hoarse. By 2029, the town, now little more than a scatter of lights along the rerouted road, had dwindled to 73 souls who still answered to the old post office box. Among them moved a woman named Miriam Calder, 61 years old, librarian by title, keeper of nothing by vocation. She had never married, never left the valley, yet she carried the accumulated stillness of every departure that had come before her as though it were her own childhood memory. Each evening she closed the single-room library at dusk, walked the half-mile to her small house, and sat in the dark without turning on a lamp. The silence in that room had weight now. It pressed against the ribs the way deep water presses. Miriam did not fight it. She simply noted how the pressure changed shape when she allowed herself to wonder whether the body she inhabited was any more permanent than the snow that had once covered Ruth, Esther, and Clara Hensley. One October night, the power failed again, not from storm but from ordinary decay. The lines had grown brittle with age, the transformers tired. Darkness arrived without ceremony. Miriam remained in her chair. She felt the absence of light, not as loss, but as simplification. In that simplification, the old spiral turned once more, revealing a layer no previous generation had named aloud. That even the act of choosing to lie down had been another assertion of self, a final proud signature on a document that was never meant to be signed. The true release, she understood, required no decision at all. It required only the cessation of deciding. The realization arrived without drama, the way a leaf lets go when the stem has already forgotten its purpose. She rose, left the door unlatched, and walked into the field behind her house. No llave, no ceremony. She simply lowered herself onto the dry grass and waited for the night to do whatever work it chose. The temperature dropped. Dew formed, then frost. By morning, the shape that had been Miriam Calder was a gentle mound indistinguishable from any other rise in the stubble. When neighbors found the open door and the untouched bed, they did not call authorities. They folded the few garments she had left on the table, sweater, scarf, the thin silver ring she had worn since girlhood, and placed them in the same unmarked chest that now rested beneath the floorboards of the old church. No note this time. None was needed. The silence had learned to speak for itself. The pattern no longer required entire families. It had grown economical, precise. A truck driver passing through on the rerouted highway would pull over for no reason he could name, walk 20 paces into the grass, and lie down. A teenager scrolling on her phone at 3 a.m. would set the device aside mid-sentence, step onto the back porch, and simply stop. The county coroner, an outsider brought in after the last local doctor retired, filed each case as exposure, undetermined intent. He never noticed that the bodies were always found facing the same direction, northwest, toward the exact center of the plain where the Voss cabin had once stood. He never noticed that the expressions were never peaceful in the ordinary sense, but calm, with the absolute absence of any question left to ask. In the spring of 2034, the State Historical Society quietly returned the garments and pages from the 2017 excavation. No explanation accompanied the delivery, only a form letter citing repatriation of culturally sensitive materials. The chest was reopened beneath the church floor. The new contents were added without ceremony. Miriam's sweater, the truck driver's denim jacket, the teenager's cracked phone still open to an unsent message that read only, "It's okay to." The spiral had begun to fold the present into the past so seamlessly that no seam remained. Outside the valley, the world continued its noisy multiplication. Cities swelling, screens glowing, voices rising in outrage and celebration. Yet every year, a few more strangers found their way to the plain for reasons they could never articulate. A podcaster researching rural decline. A climate scientist measuring permafrost melt that was not actually melting here. A young man fleeing a life he could no longer pronounce. Each arrived, felt the hush settle behind the sternum, and within days, or sometimes hours, chose the same unchosen path. Their vehicles were found with engines running, doors open, playlists still cycling through songs no one would finish. The authorities eventually stopped investigating. Missing persons reports filed in distant states simply aged in databases until the algorithm itself seemed to lose interest. By 2041, the town had become something the maps no longer bothered to name. The last streetlight flickered out in November and was never replaced. The remaining 31 residents moved through their days with the slow, deliberate economy of people who know the next sentence they speak might be the last one they need. They did not gather. They did not mourn. They simply left their doors unlocked and their fires banked low. When the final elder, Elias Crow himself, now 94, felt the familiar pressure rise in his chest on a windless afternoon, he walked to the exact center of the old Voss field, lay down in the place where the photograph had once captured 7 smiling adults and 9 children, and closed his eyes. The snow that year arrived 3 weeks early, covering him with the same impartial care it had shown every soul before him. There is no one left now to record the ledger. No one left to rename the valley or reroute another road. The plain stretches unbroken from horizon to horizon, its surface smooth as a breath held for centuries. Occasionally a satellite passes overhead and photographs an anomaly it cannot classify. Subtle variations in albedo, faint geometric patterns visible only from orbit, the suggestion of an open hand pressed into the earth and slowly opening wider. Ground crews are never sent. The data is archived under natural terrain variation and forgotten. Yet the invitation has not ended. It has only grown quieter, more intimate, until it no longer requires a body to receive it. Those who drive the rerouted highway at night sometimes feel it brush against the inside of the windshield like a question asked in a language older than speech. Some pull over, some do not. Either choice is irrelevant. The plane has learned that resistance and surrender are merely different names for the same eventual stillness. And still the snow falls, and still it waits, not for the last soul to lie down, but for the last illusion of soul to realize it was never standing at all, in the final years. When even the rerouted highway had been reclaimed by grass and dust, the plane no longer distinguished between day and night. Light simply thinned until it was indistinguishable from shadow. Shadow thickened until it carried the same pale weight as dawn. No one remained to mark the calendar. The last house, Miriam Calder's, stood with its door ajar for 7 winters, snow drifting across the threshold in soft, repeating waves until the floorboards were buried and the roofline softened into the same gentle curve as every other rise in the field. There was no last departure to witness, no final figure walking out to lie down beneath the stars. The act of leaving had long since ceased to require motion. It had become the default state of the air itself. A crow that once perched on the splintered fence post simply stopped beating its wings one afternoon and fell forward into the snow without cry or struggle. The wind carried no scent of decay afterward. Decay would have implied separation between what was and what continued to be. Instead, the bird's form sank slowly, feather by feather, until the white surface closed over it like an eyelid that had never known the need to open. Beneath that same surface, the accumulated layers had grown vast. Not graves in the ordinary sense. Graves presume intention, ceremony, a story told by the living about the dead. These were only absences that had folded themselves back into presence. The folded garments, the thin sheaves of paper, the cracked screens, and silver rings and denim jackets. All of them had settled deeper with each season until pressure and time compressed them into something finer than memory. No archaeologist would ever return. No satellite would photograph the faint handprint again. The geometry had completed itself. An open palm that had finally closed around nothing and found the gesture sufficient. Now, the silence is absolute. Not because sound has been forbidden, but because there is no longer anything that requires distinction to exist. The plane does not remember the names Voss, Hensley, Calder, Crow. It does not remember the spiral or the invitation or the slow pressure behind the sternum. Memory would require a separate thing to do the remembering. There is only the field, stretching without edge or center. Its surface smooth so perfectly that no footprint could ever mark it again. No shadow could ever fall differently from any other. Occasionally, though occasionally is already too human a word, a single flake detaches itself high above and begins the long descent. It does not hurry. It does not choose its path. It simply falls through air that has forgotten how to resist, through cold that has forgotten how to wound, until it meets the surface and disappears without ripple or sound. The place where it lands is indistinguishable from the place where it began. The distinction between sky and earth, between falling and having always been fallen, has long since dissolved. There is no witness to this. There is no one left to feel the hush settle one final time. There is only the plain, vast, and unnameable, holding within its even whiteness every surrender that was ever offered and every resistance that was ever abandoned. And the snow continues to fall, not as an event, not toward an end, simply as what remains when every question has been answered by the same unbroken answer. Nothing separate was ever here at all. The field receives the next flake, then the next, then all of them at once, forever. No voice rises to say it is finished. No silence deepens to mark the close. There is only white upon white, extending without boundary, waiting without need of anything to wait for.